In this week's tutorial, we're looking at World War II. World War II is the greatest event in human history in the sense that it involves the most number of people and it is actually truly a world war. Therefore, in order to try cover it in a 1 hour tutorial is pretty much impossible. So I'm mainly going to be focusing on the war in Europe. That is where the war is won and lost. And just going over just the main points because obviously just way too much detail to try cover, and no historian knows everything about the wars, particularly World War Two. So what we're going through is the origins of war. Why did World War Two start? The early German advances, and then the turning points in 1942 and 43, when then we look at how Japan enters the war in the Pacific very quickly, the Holocaust very quickly, and then the Allied counteroffensive, which win the war in Europe, and then how victory is won in the Pacific. So obviously there's two main theatres of war, the Pacific and Europe. So mainly focus on Europe. So the origins. What are the origins of World War Two? After World War One, there was a concerted effort to have this thing called collective security. So this collective security is this idea that as a collective, as a group of nations, we can secure world peace. And so they start the League of Nations, which is kind of a precursor to United Nations. And the whole purpose of the League of Nations is to prevent another war from happening. However, by the time you hit the 1930s, particularly with the onset of the Great Depression, the nations who were felt slighted due to the Treaty of Versailles, they were becoming more and more aggressive. They were dissatisfied with the way they'd been treated after World War One, and therefore they wanted to kind of forge their own destiny in that sense. And so the 1930s just gradually showed that collective security and the League of Nations weren't strong enough to actually keep these nations in check. Germany is obviously comes to mind when people who are, nations are disappointed or angry about the Treaty of Versailles. Some things that Hitler does, we'll talk about more later, but 1935 he announces he's going to reconstruct or construct an air force, a Luftwaffe. And then later in that year, he also announces that they're going to bring back in conscription, two things that have been outlawed by the Treaty of Versailles. And he's kind of just testing the waters here. So what are the Allied nations going to do? What are France and Britain going to do? Because what I'm doing is going against what the Treaty of Versailles said. And he finds that they don't really do much. They get angry about it, they complain about it, but there's no real follow through. In Italy, Mussolini, he really exploits the idea that Italy had actually lost out thanks to the Treaty of Versailles. They weren't really included. Italy don't do a lot in World War One, and so I suppose you could argue that why should they really be included as part of they were part of the victors technically, but didn't really do much in the war. But Mussolini really manipulates that point in order to gain a lot of popularity. Japan also felt slighted after World War One. They are on the Allied side, but there was essentially a race clause within the treaty where essentially kind of said that the Japanese aren't really part of aren't us like us Europeans, and so they can just keep Asia to themselves if they want, but we don't really have much to do with them. And so this, so Japan, as I mentioned when we looked at the modernization of Japan invade Manchuria in 1931, and the League of Nations protest that. But don't really follow through with anything, so Japan get away with it, and that increases their militarization of their government, and so they get more and more confident out of it. What's happening in Europe in the mid-30s is you've got the Abyssinian crisis. This is where Mussolini invades Abyssinia and modern-day Ethiopia, and he's trying to recreate the Roman Empire. So he's just expanding. He's invading in order to expand his empire. Um, and so the Abyssinians, they go to the League of Nations. They try to get the League of Nations to come down hard on Italy. The League of Nations, led by Britain and France, they say that they essentially tell Italy to stop it, but don't really follow through with anything other than that. The reason was Britain and France, their economies are really struggling after World War One and then into the Great Depression, and plus their societies had only were still really getting over World War One, and so they didn't want to be involved in anything that might lead to another European war. And so essentially, all they do is just kind of wiggle their finger at them, say, no, 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 don't do that, Italy, but don't really follow through. The Spanish Civil War is another one. So the Spanish Civil War is between left wing and right wing politics. Um, and so the left wing government, they're trying to take over. And so the right wings are trying to prevent that from happening. And long story short, the Soviet Union is saying, hey, why don't we support the Communist Party in Spain and try to get them in? That way we've got a communist ally in Europe. But that doesn't work because the Italians, particularly the Germans, the Nazis, they see the right wing fascist group in Spain as an ally, a future ally, and so they support. They send a lot of troops and resources over to the Franco side, who's will become the head of Spain, and so they win the Spanish Civil War. The right wing side wins it, and once again, it showed Stalin a few things. One, that there was no support in Europe for communist regimes, it appeared, but also that the French and the British, they weren't really going to do much in Europe at that time. And so the Soviet Union comes out of the Spanish Civil War just wondering who exactly they're going to try ally with. Um, the next key development in tension in Europe is the appeasement policy led by Britain and France to do with Nazi Germany. Because they lacked the will to fight, they had this policy of appeasement, trying to just keep everyone happy in order to prevent a European war because they cannot actually, they don't think they can actually go into it. So what brings this about is it's a couple of incidences. Firstly, in 1936, Hitler remilitarizes the Rhineland. So the Rhineland is in Western Europe, in Western Germany, I mean. And as part of the Treaty of Versailles, they weren't allowed to have any, Germany wasn't allowed to have any military troops in that area because over here you've got France. And so France wanted essentially a buffer zone. And so because World War One, they'd invaded through this area. And so first thing that Hitler does is he sends troops back in there and he kind of waits and sees what's going to happen. France, they're angry about it, but they don't lack the ability. Well, sorry, they do lack the ability to actually respond in any meaningful way. And Britain aren't on the French side with this. They don't really renounce what Hitler's done. They don't really do anything. And the lack of response by the French and the British just encourages Hitler that he can continue with his plans of expansion. So the next, in 1938, he's going to annex Austria with the Anschluss. There's a whole history behind this, which will take a while. But Austria, they speak German there. Hitler himself is Austrian. He always viewed himself as part of the German Empire. So they cause a couple of the Austrian Nazis kind of cause a couple of incidences there. They ask for essentially a plebiscite. So they want people to vote. Do you want to become part of the German Empire or stay independent from Germany? And they vote that they want to become part of the German Empire, and so they send troops in. Once again, Hitler defends this as one of the key points of the League of Nations was that each country should have self-determination. So they should be able to determine if they want to be part of an empire, if they want to be independent. And technically, Austria determined that they wanted to be part of the German Empire, so he defends it in that way. Then he next focuses on the Sudetenland, this area here, as technically part of Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland was full of German-speaking peoples who had actually been originally part of the German Empire, but after World War One, Germany had lost territory and actually lost part of its country, and they literally overnight invent this country called Czechoslovakia. And so Czechoslovakia was full of people from different cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds. It was just a hodgepodge of many different types of people that overnight all of a sudden you've been made one. So Hitler views Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland as essentially his. And so he goes in 1938 and he literally invades. And so he invades there, and after the after he invades the Sudetenland, he threatens that he's going to invade Czechoslovakia. And so this is where they call for a 2-day conference in Munich in 1938. And the leaders of France and Britain, Italy are going to meet there, and Germany, obviously, and they're going to discuss what they're going to do with the Sudetenland. Should Germany be allowed to keep it, or should they have to hand it back? Western powers like Britain and France, they'd pledged that they were going to protect Czechoslovakia, but here's a problem. So here we've got Chamberlain, Didier, who's the French president, Hitler, Mussolini, and Chano, who's Italian as well. Now, question is, who's missing? Well, there's 2 key people missing. One, there's no one from the Czechoslovakia there. Literally, the representatives from Czechoslovakia had to stand at the door, a closed door, and listen to what was happening to their country. And so they weren't invited into these talks about what are we gonna do with this. The other big player in Europe that's not there, you'll notice, is Stalin. So the Soviet Union weren't invited, and Stalin really takes that personally. And so the Stalin is viewing what the West are doing, so what Britain and France are doing, that he's starting to take that personally, because if you look at the map, Hitler is starting to head eastwards. And so everyone knows after he takes Czechoslovakia, his next goal will be Poland, which is what happens. And he's heading east, and over here you've got the Soviet Union. So Stalin thinks that the French and the British are pushing Hitler eastwards away from themselves. So Stalin really is slighted that he's not invited to this this meeting. The Munich conference is where, maybe through Neville Chamberlain, they agree that Hitler can keep the Sudetenland, but that's it. He can't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain, it's a great embarrassment for him. He gets off the plane back in Britain, and holds up. It's not actually the Munich peace agreement, but he holds up a piece of paper and says, this ensures peace in our time. And famous, last words. And so Hitler leaves. So the Western powers, they leave and go, okay, Hitler's happy now. He's been appeased. He should be done. That should be it. Hitler leaves and literally says to von Ribbentrop, his foreign minister, I've seen these guys at Munich. They won't oppose us. They're too scared to actually fight us. And so rather than appease Hitler, it actually encourages him that these Western powers, they're not going to do anything against us. The last piece of the puzzle that did need to be put in place was what to do with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union were massive. It's a massive country, Russia. And so Hitler needed to make sure he didn't have a two-front war, because in early 1939, he invades the rest of Czechoslovakia, and France and Britain say, if you invade another country, essentially if you invade Poland, which everyone knows is the next one, then we will declare war on you. Hitler, even though he said, they won't do it, he knows that if we have a two-front war, that's what really stuffed us up in World War One. So he wants to avoid trying to fight on two fronts. Now, he can't stop the Western powers because they've already threatened him. So he goes over and goes, okay, what are we going to do with the Soviet Union? Um, so the Soviet Union and the Nazis meet together in May and June of 1939, and they come up with this Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. They, ideologically speaking, they absolutely hate each other, but it was convenient for both sides to actually sign this non-aggression pact. As you can imagine, the pact is essentially we won't attack you, and when and when we attack Poland, we'll split Poland in half and give you half, and we'll have the other half. Um, and so the reason why Stalin signs it is because in 1937-38, he has purged the Red Army, to the Soviet army, because he suspects it of being disloyal to him. So he purges it, gets rid of a whole bunch of officers. So he's not in play. He doesn't need to go to war now. He's actually happy for these capitalist countries to fight each other, and then the Soviet Union will come in at the end, win, and then spread communism everywhere. The Nazis need to sign it because they're going to fight the West. They're going to go over, fight France really quickly, knock them out of the war, and then eventually they'll go over and fight the Russians or the Soviet Union, which is exactly what happens. Alan Bullock claims that the pact was the surest way to isolate Poland, to deter the Western powers from interfering, and to keep the conflict localized. Um, Thomas Childers, he writes that the German-Soviet non-aggression pact made war in Europe inevitable. Um, Even after the war, after World War II, leading into the Cold War, the British and particularly the Americans, they never forgave the Soviet Union for signing a pact with Nazi Germany that led to war. And so they see this as a great betrayal, and it's one of the tensions between the two. Um, so what happens? After they sign the treaty, then war is going to go ahead. They're going to invade Poland. Hitler expects to invade Poland. It's going to be just like invading Czechoslovakia. It'll be a couple of weeks. It'll be over. The Western powers won't do anything about it. In 1939, 1940, and even into 1941, it's the Great German Advance. So what happens is 4:45 a.m. Some German troops dress up in Polish uniforms and cross the Polish border, and then shoot back at their own German garrison. So it looks like Polish troops are shooting on Germans. They get some local bodies from the local concentration camp, or the nearest concentration camp, dress them up in German uniforms, and then they're the victims. And so Hitler spreads to the world that Poland had attacked the German garrison on the border and killed some German troops. And so that's his precursor to actually going in and fighting Polish. Even when you're a dictator hell bent on war, you've still got to make yourself look like the victim, because that's the way the Nazis worked. And so they send in their troops. On the 3rd of September, Britain declared war on Germany because they hadn't pulled out of Poland. But the war in Poland, is just great success for Germany. They advance at a rapid rate. They use this new military tactic called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It's where the armored divisions are going to smash through enemy lines. So the Panzer divisions, Panzer is the German word for tank. The tanks are going to smash through enemy lines. They're going to encircle the enemy, capture them, but then the infantry come in and kind of mop up. As before that's even completed, the Panzers then move on to the next line. All the while, the Luftwaffe, so the Air Force, is over the top, both directing and bombing from above. This is going to be very different from World War One warfare, where it's not going to be trench warfare. It's not going to be slow. It's going to be fast, rapid, get in quickly. There is an economic reason why Hitler wants to do this, because the quicker the wars go, the less it costs, the less impact on German life. Because unlike in World War One, when war is declared and everyone's really happy about it, when Hitler invades Poland, and particularly when the British declare war on Germany, there is a lack of enthusiasm, and Hitler notes it, and a lot of Nazi leaders note it, that there's not there wasn't a great celebration. People were anxious that they were going to war again and that Britain had actually got involved. 28th of September, Warsaw garrison surrender and they've taken Poland. Other than a token force, the French and the British had done nothing. They'd left Poland to its fate. What happens for the next few months is what's called the Phony War or the Sitzkrieg, where there's technically Europe is in a state of war, but there's really not that much fighting happening. Hitler and the Nazis go up into the Low Countries, up into Holland, particularly up into Scandinavia, and they're going to grab territory in order to get iron ore, in particular, and other resources. Um, but the next major battle comes with the German advance into France. Um, the French had put all their trust in this line, which kind of goes out of the screen, which is called the Maginot Line. Maginot Line was just a whole series of fortifications which would be easily defended. And it was a World War One mentality. It was a really defensive mentality. They were going in there to endure, a few years of war. We'll beat the Germans again. That's exactly how it happened in World War One. And this kind of two completely different mindsets where the Germans have this new tactic, blitzkrieg, which is all fast and moving, and the French particularly have this defensive mindset. World War II shows that you cannot fight wars on the defensive. And so the Germans invade, and they invade through the Ardennes forest. They came down through Belgium into France that way. In World War One, and the French believe that's what they're going to do again. But Hitler, there's kind of a story behind this, but kind of by accident, they have to change their plans because their original plans get caught by the Allies, and so they're like, "Oh, the Allies know our plan now. Why don't we come up with something different?" And so they come up with this new plan to go through the Ardennes forest, which the French didn't think anyone could actually get through there. But they go in a new way and they just punch their way behind the French, who are on the front line, and the punch way into France, and they delve deeply into France, and it takes them 35 days, and they've taken France. So what took the great imperial forces, German forces, 4 years of slugging their way through France, and they still don't even take Paris or any of the great places in France. It takes Hitler and his army 35 days. And so, 22nd of June, the French sign this armistice, surrendering to the Germans, and France has fallen. There's the great escape of the BF, the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. But at that stage, that kind of looked like a token. Okay, they can leave. Who cares? It's not like the British can really do anything at this stage. Hitler is absolutely on cloud nine. So he visits Paris. Doesn't come across. This is actually like 6 o'clock in the morning. And then he returns back to Germany, and he is an absolute hero. Everything he touches seems to turn to success. He seems to be a military genius, and so he is loved and adored by. In 1940, 1941, there's no point trying to resist Hitler. People aren't going to be on your side because he's restored the German greatness. Um, After you've conquered most of Western Europe, where's your next target? It's going to be Britain. So he doesn't really. Hitler is really reluctant to fight Britain. He views them as racially close to them, but he also is really impressed with the fact that they've got the greatest empire ever. And so he reluctantly starts up this Battle of Britain. Operation Sea Lion is the code name for their invasion force or invasion plans for Britain. But they need to win air superiority over the English Channel. And so this starts the great Air Force battles for the Battle of Britain. Germany, they plan to bomb key military, industrial, civilian targets. The RAF have really good organization, but they also have really good radar. And the Germans don't really understand the importance of this early in the war. And so the RAF can actually see where the Germans are coming from, the direction, and how many are actually coming. Um, one one German Luftwaffe crew get lost one night and accidentally bomb London, and then Hitler goes, "Oh, this is actually maybe a good new tactic." So the Blitz starts, which is where they bomb civilian targets, um, and these last for months on end, destroy a whole lot of infrastructure, obviously killing a number of people. The whole point at this stage of bombing civilian targets is that civilians will come out and go, "Oh, stuff this, we don't want to fight in this war anymore," and sue for peace. It doesn't work. So bombing of civilians, both by the Allies or by the Germans, never led to much pressure or really any pressure to actually stop the war from civilians. General Werner Krepp, who's a member of the Luftwaffe, wrote this after the war. Though the air battles over England were perhaps a triumph of skill and bravery so far as the German air crews were concerned, from a strategic point of view, it was a failure and contributed to our ultimate defeat. The decision to fight it marked a turning point in the history of the Second World War. And so the Battle of Britain, what it did, the most significant thing it did, it really crushed. It significantly impacted the Luftwaffe, so the German Air Force, but it meant that Hitler had to keep a few 100,000 soldiers in France to make sure that the British weren't going to invade. And that's going to be key because as the war goes on, his troops are going to get in resources going to get stretched more and more. And the fact that he doesn't manage to make Britain sue for peace is going to come back to actually bite him in the butt later. There are some key turning points in the war in Europe, and one doesn't even happen in Europe, it happens in North Africa. Italy invade Egypt, which is held by the British at the time, but Italy are poorly trained, poorly equipped, and just really are a thorn in the side of Germany. Even though they're allied together, Germany probably really wished that they weren't at times. They attack the first battle of El Alamein. Axis forces under Rommel attack and take over, and they also capture ports like Bardia, Tobruk, where they fight the Australians. The second battle of El Alamein becomes one of the key battles of the war between October in November of 1942. It ultimately results in the Allied victory. The significance of it were there are several significances of it. One, the Axis powers, so the Italians and the Germans, they lost a significant number of resources and soldiers, so 50,000 are dead, another 400,000 prisoners of war, about 8,000 aircrafts are lost. It also promotes General Montgomery of the British Army as someone who can defeat the Germans. It's the first German defeat, a significant defeat in World War II, and particularly the first land defeat on land. And so it's a great propaganda tool for the Allies that we can actually beat these guys. But Hitler's attention, he never really cared too much about the North African campaign. It was just a necessary thing to help our allies out. He'd moved his attention back to the Soviet Union and what he labels Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which was essentially Germany. It begins on the 22nd of June 1941, which I don't know if Hitler meant this, but it was the same date that Napoleon invaded Russia, and obviously Napoleon invades it, and that's what destroys his whole campaign and ruins his empire. Great irony there. But at first, for the first few months, it is just a wonder invasion. You've got Army Group North, Centre, and South, and they're ploughing their way through the Soviet Union. Stalin was told in advance that there are a great number of German troops at the border and that it looks like they're going to invade. And Stalin didn't believe it because we've got this non-aggression pact. Hitler wouldn't do that to me, and so he doesn't believe it. And so the first few days when they attack, yeah, within 2 days they've got 50 miles in, uh, and so Stalin essentially goes into hiding um, during this time. Hitler then makes, and so for the first few weeks, it looks like they're going to absolutely obliterate the Soviet Union. When they invade the Soviet Union, the troops, because they're invading people who they think are a lesser race to them, they said to the Germans say to their own troops that you don't expect to be treated well there. They don't treat you like normal human beings would because they're barbaric. And so essentially all the rules of war go out the window. If they surrender, shoot them. Things like that. So the Operation Barbarossa is absolutely horrific. Um, and after about 2 weeks, the Germans think they're going to win within a month. And Hitler says, "Oh, once we smash down the door, it'll be easy." Problem is, he makes a real significant strategic mistake early on. He sends the Panzers are advancing really quickly, but then he sends them down to help out Army Group South at Kiev. Now, this delays the attack on Moscow. If he'd advanced on Moscow, Moscow wouldn't have had that much time to get itself prepared, but because he delays it, Moscow can prepare itself, but also by delaying it, it means that they're actually fighting, as you can see the dates here, they're actually fighting with the onset of winter. Hitler had not given any of his troops, hadn't allowed any of his troops to be given winter clothing for the invasion because it was all meant to be over by the time winter comes. So as it starts to get colder in October, they're asking the German soldiers are asking for winter gear to actually keep themselves warm. Hitler is really reluctant because once you give them their gear, maybe they won't fight enough. But the key battle, and I would say this is maybe the key battle turning point in the whole war, and it conveniently is roughly halfway through the war, is the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad is an important industrial city, obviously it's named after Stalin, and it sees some of the most intense fighting. This is fighting that is house to house, street by street. It involves Air Force, Panzers. It's real. It's real horrific kind of warfare. Um, initially for the Germans, it's going really well. By the 4th of October, it looks like the German victory is going to be certain, but the problem is that it overextended their lines, and they'll rely not just on their own troops, but on troops from other countries like Romania and that who weren't as invested. By December, by November, the Russians are secretly bringing in reinforcements, which the Germans don't realize. In December, they launch a counteroffensive, and sorry, this stage, the Germans are launching a counteroffensive in order to break out because they've actually been surrounded in Stalingrad, and so they try to break out. The Sixth Army is in there with General Paulus, but that fails. Therefore, they are stuck in there. It looks like they're going to actually surrender, and Hitler says to Paulus that no German army has surrendered. He makes him a field marshal in order to say no German field marshal has ever surrendered. Paulus has no option other than surrendering. So on the 31st of January, he finally surrenders. And it is a key turning point in the war because from that moment onwards, the German advance into the Soviet Union stops. That's as far as they get. So this is the start of 1943, they spend roughly the next year or so fighting a couple of key battles, the Battle of Kursk, for example. But in 1944, the Russians will launch their counteroffensive, which will push them all the way back into Germany. And eventually, the Soviet Union, the Russians will be on will be fighting in Berlin. So Stalingrad is the key part of that. It bled the German army dry, as Truman says there. Um, so after that, Hitler and Hitler's in denial about it, but all the smart generals in the German army know this is it for us. If we can't get a victory in Stalingrad, yeah, if we lose momentum at any stage, we're going to lose the war. Well, they're fighting and Operation Barbarossa is going on. You've got the Japanese getting involved, so they bomb Pearl Harbor. There've been growing tensions within between the US and the Japanese throughout the 1930s because, for one thing, the US had frozen Japanese assets. And so the Japanese launched this attack on Pearl Harbor the 7th of December, but they failed to actually destroy the fleet, and they failed to destroy things like the gas and the petrol that's been kept there, that all the fuel sources, and so they do sink a number of ships, but it's not the killer knockout blow that they needed. And there were some within the Japanese government and military that said, unless it's a knockout blow that the US go, okay, we're not getting involved in the war. Unless it's that, we will lose. And so essentially from the very beginning, um, the fact that they don't knock the US out, in fact, they get the US now involved and angry, shows that it's kind of over before it's even begun. There's a conspiracy theory that the Roosevelt knew that this was coming and allowed it to happen in order to get the US involved, but there's not much to that. However, once again from 1941, for the first few, half of the war in the Pacific, it's the Japanese on the advance. They advance down in Southeast Asia. They take French Indochina, Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, heading to Malaya. They crucially take Singapore, which is British held, and Singapore is an important naval base for the British, and its navy in Singapore was what helped protect Australia. And so, with the fall of Singapore in early 1942, Australia is really now vulnerable. They obviously continue to advance into Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Very quickly, the war from 42 to 45, Guadalcanal becomes a significant battle, mainly fought by the Americans, and obviously other significant ones. The Kokoda Trail that becomes important because the Japanese are trying to set up an air force or um, use the air what's it called the runway essentially in Port Moresby in order to start bombing the north of Australia and then potentially invade the north of Australia. But the crucial battles, one at Guadalcanal by the Americans and by the Australians at the Kokoda Trail in Papua New Guinea, mean that the invasion of Australia, where a lot of American troops are stationed, never happens, even though they do bomb Darwin about 74 times. Most of 43, 44, into 45 is just what they call island hopping, where they advance, invading various islands, Iwo Jima, all those famous American ones that you see. I'm no expert in the war in the Pacific. I teach the war in Europe, so I'll just bypass that. The rest of that. The Holocaust is obviously happening. Trying to get through the Holocaust in 5 minutes is going to be difficult. The Holocaust wasn't, I said this in the Darwinism and eugenics lecture, but the Holocaust was not an unintended consequence of the war. It was always something that was part of the war effort. The killing of the Jews was part of the war effort. It would help Germany succeed and help them win the war because you're getting rid of the vermin and the parasites within your own people, and therefore your people is going to come out stronger, and your stronger people are going to win wars. But the Holocaust happens during the war because you need the war to kind of cover what's actually happening. People are, when there's a fight happening over there, people aren't worried about what's happening to these two people off to the side, for example. Um, and so when the when the war happens, now the Nazis can start to implement some new ideas. The Holocaust develops as the war goes on. They don't have gas chambers in mind from the very beginning. They experiment with different ways to do things. The first thing that they need to do though is get the Jews into certain areas where they can then control them. So they set up ghettos. So ghettos are set up in order to get them all together whilst the Germans decide what are we going to do with these people. So in the ghettos, that's where they have to wear the yellow armbands. They have to do forced labour. They set up these things called Udenrats or Jewish councils, and the Jewish council are in charge of ghetto life. The Jewish councils are in charge of making sure if the Germans come in and say we need 500 people to go on these transports, then you need to provide 500 people. After a while, these Jewish councils, the Udenrats, they start to realise where these trains are going to. And so there's controversy in the Jewish community about should these people have Udenrats actually supported, gone along with what the Germans were saying. The ghettos don't. Well, some ghettos would last a couple of days, some would last a couple of years, but as they start to implement the final solution by late 1941 into 1942, they start to liquidate or destroy the ghettos. Because during this time period they have the meeting at what's called the Wannsee Conference, where they decide we need to remove the Jews, take them to the general area in Poland, and that's where they decide they're going to start killing them. The first step in the killing process, overt killing process, is what's called the Einsatzgruppen, or the killing squads. So during Operation Barbarossa, when they head into the Soviet Union, behind the German army, is these Einsatzgruppen. They were there in Poland, but it's the Operation Barbarossa where they really start to do a lot more damage. The Einsatzgruppen, their role was to hunt out enemies of the German state. And so they could be saboteurs, they could be commissars, so communists, and Jews. Now, of those three, there's a couple others, but of those three, you can't spot a saboteur just by looking at them. You can't spot a communist person by looking at them, but you can, but according to the Nazis, spot a Jew by looking at them. And a lot of these societies, particularly in Eastern Europe, you'd have towns that are mostly just Jewish towns. And so it was really easy to spot, to track down Jews. The Einsatzgruppen in many ways are the scariest part, I think, of the Holocaust, because they hunt down people in their houses, take them out. Their method of killing was to take people, walk them out of town, make them dig a mass grave, and then you line them up and you shoot them, and you'd shoot them 9 to 5. That's how these happened. Himmler said that the Einsatzgruppen had essentially a responsibility before God and Hitler in what they were doing to get rid of these vermin. Now, at first they just targeted men, but then by the late summer they start to target men, women, children, just anyone. Here's a copy. This is one page from what's called the Jaeger report. This is coming from Einsatzgruppen Group A. And so here we have, to make sense of it, the first column you've got the date, then you've got the city or the location, and then you've got the amount of deaths. So you got Uden is just the word for Jew, or in this case it's Jewish men. Then you got Jewish women, so you got 230 Jewish men, 275 Jewish women, and 159 Uden Kinder, Jewish children. And so on this day at Zadeva, they killed 664. And so this is a method of killing that is really clinical and effective. And so, and they kept detailed records because they wanted to then be able to brag that they had areas that were Uden free or Jewish free, free of Jews. But killing people all day has an impact on people, no matter what your ideology. And so they realize that this mass way of killing people is not going to work long term. So we've got to come up with a new method. At first, they come up with this thing called the gas van. And the gas van is where you just load people into the back of a van, and then you get the exhaust pipe, and you just pipe the exhaust straight back into it, carbon monoxide, and eventually you drive around for however long, half an hour or so. Everyone in the back dies, and then you bury them. The gas van, obviously, as you can tell, will give them the idea for eventual gas chambers, which are these death camps. They're in green, they're all the concentration camps, but you notice all the death camps are actually kept over in Poland. They're away from Germany. People in Germany were never meant to find out about this, maybe till after the war, particularly if Germany wins. But during the war, they weren't meant to find out about it. Hence why all the death camps are over in Poland. All right, so you got 6 death camps: Klemno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Madinac, and Auschwitz-Birkenau is the most famous. At its height, Auschwitz, for example, would be killing 6,000 a day. And so you get them in. All the death camps are on major train lines. That's how you would actually get them in. There are some accounts of, I found one account of a Jewish Sonderkommando, so someone who the Nazis forced them to work with them at the death camps, who were Jewish, and he tried to essentially go in with the Jews from a train to die with them because he didn't want to live anymore. And these 2 girls found him and said, "No, you need to go and tell everyone what's happening here." So yeah, the death camps, the Holocaust, obviously, there's a lot more you could say, but continue on. By 1944, the tide has well and truly turned, and the Allies can start their counteroffensive. The first one is with D-Day. So Dwight Eisenhower, the future president, is in charge of D-Day. Its operation name is Operation Overlord. They're going to go at first. They were going to go on the 5th of June, but the weather was really bad. And then on the 6th of June, they wake up, it's going to be bad again. And they've got this, I think he was 21 or 22-year-old meteorologist, and he's got to make the decision about whether the weather's going to be good enough on the 6th of June to go. So essentially, the whole Allied counteroffensive in the West relies on this 22-year-old who's got to make the decision. He said, "Yeah, go for it," which is pretty crazy. D-Day's, once again, a lot of information you can find on D-Day. They land in Normandy. They'd set up a dummy army to pretend like they're going to land in the Pas-de-Calais, which is the shortest distance from England to France, across the English Channel. They'd set up they had wooden planes, they had blow up tanks, they dropped essentially aluminium foil over the channel, because on radar that would make it look like there's ships going across. So they had this kind of massive dummy campaign for the Germans to think that the counteroffensive was coming in the Pas-de-Calais, but it comes in Normandy. Some of them are able to go ashore pretty quickly. Utah, and particularly Omaha Beach, that they're particularly intensive, those kind of landings for the Americans. But long story short, they land. Now, Ernst Rommel had said, who's the German general, he'd said, if in the first 24 hours we can't kick them off the beach, then we've lost the war. And so that's how important this is. Hitler, so they land at crack of dawn on the 6th of June, but Hitler had this habit ever since, well, pretty much his whole life, of staying up to the early hours in the morning, then sleeping until late morning or midday. Problem with that was they land, no one wants to wake him up, and so he doesn't find out till about 10 o'clock that they've landed. And they weren't allowed to move any of the panzer divisions without Hitler's express permission. And so when Hitler finds out, he thinks, oh, this isn't the real one, this is the decoy. And so it's only after, hours, 6 to 8 hours, that he actually releases the panzer divisions. And so that's a crucial reason for why the Americans, the British, the Canadians are actually able to get there and stay on the beach, and then eventually fight their way across Normandy, take vital ports back so they can keep resources coming in. D-Day is also significant because they lose a whole heap of troops once again that they can't. The Germans lose troops that they can't resupply. It changes. They're able to, as they work their way across France and into Belgium, they're able to get important ports back, like Antwerp. So that's important for the British and the Allies getting supplies into themselves, but it's also restricting supplies being sent to and resources being sent to Germany. And so they're able to cut off Germany's supply lines and resource lines through the D-Day. It also changes attitudes towards the war effort within Germany. People realise that the British and the French are coming. A couple of key battles as they go across: Operation Market Garden, where they try to it's a mass parachute drop where they're trying to get key bridges. They capture some of them. They don't get all of them. This is if you've heard of the saying, "The bridge too far." This is where it comes from. Ultimately it fails because of weather conditions, and that the Germans fight back. Don't have time to keep going through it. The Battle of the Bulge is the last German hurrah on the Western Front. It's in the Ardennes region. They're fighting the Americans. There's really intense fighting, but it's essentially just a last effort by Hitler pushing the troops. And so they do. It's called the Battle of the Bulge because they're pushing a bulge, and there's a little bulge in the American lines, and the Germans are trying to break through it and make it a massive bulge. But they ultimately don't succeed. One thing that's not often taught in histories on World War II is what the Soviets are doing on the Eastern Front. So they have this counteroffensive called Operation Bagration. Operation Bagration is set for the June 22nd, which is the same date Hitler invaded. So I don't know if this is just the Soviet Union using their sense of humour. And they push well into... they're pushing back on the German lines and putting a lot of pressure on them. The key things that happen here is due to the simultaneous invasion at Normandy, Germany were unable to replenish their troops on the Eastern Front. And what is small scale in Normandy with D-Day and the Western Allies, it's just massive, large scale on the Eastern Front. And so Germany gets have a 350-mile front with front with only 850,000 troops, which they can't obviously replenish. The Luftwaffe is no longer controls the sky, so it's controlled by the Red Army. Hitler refuses any retreat or any even pull back to stronger fortifications, and so he says, we're not doing that. That's not what winners do. Anthony Beevor, who wrote history on this, said Hitler's orders to hold firm were totally disastrous. He refused to allow his generals any flexibility or leeway, which was totally contrary to all concepts and the teaching of the German general staff. Particularly on the Eastern Front, the Eastern Front shows how little Hitler actually knew about war and how to actually win a war. So the military genius was actually showed to be anything but. So once again, Operation Bagration is a massive thing, but the Soviets reclaimed most or almost all of their land that they had lost within the first few months. It's significant for various reasons, but first, Army Group Center is destroyed. Jeffrey Warrow, an American historian, he says the Army Group Center was the anchor to the whole German front on the Eastern Front, and it gets completely destroyed. and that means that the way into Germany is now opened up. And so now there's no army group defending the way into Germany. It is no surprise also that as D-Day is happening and this Operation Bagration, the counter-offensives, that you have the Stauffenberg plot, where they try to uh, kill Hitler. So von Stauffenberg gets in um, with Hitler, gets chummy with him. He's invited into the Wolf's Lair for these briefings. He leaves a briefcase with a bomb in it. It appears that it either fell over or someone moved it after von Stauffenberg left, because it was put on the other side of uh, the leg of the table, which is quite thick. So moved it slightly further away from Hitler, and that's what essentially saves Hitler. Hitler views that as a sign from God that he's going to essentially live forever, and that he's not going to lose. And so you see a picture of him here with Mussolini, showing Mussolini around. This is, look what happened to me, and I survived. He burst his eardrum, but he never trusted anyone again after that. The other significant thing that Operation Bagration does for the war is that it leads to what's called the Battle of Berlin, where the Soviets invade, and they actually will eventually take Berlin. It's during this time that Hitler will commit suicide in the bunker. This famous image on the right here, it's actually been photoshopped by the Soviets, because this guy who's holding the man with the flag, originally, in the original, he's actually got about 6 watches on his on his arm, so he's clearly taken them from dead bodies, and the Soviet Union didn't want people to know that, so they actually photoshopped that out. So by end of April, the war is over, and they sign the armistice in the 7th of May. And so the war in Europe is over. The war in the Pacific ends a few months later. The key reasons are obviously the dropping of the nuclear bombs. Obviously, this is a contentious issue. Depends which way you fall, whether you support what the Americans did or not. In the what President Truman, his reasoning for dropping the bomb was to invade Japan. It would cost at least another 1,000,000 American lives, let alone Japanese lives. It also the Japanese had showed themselves in the islands that they controlled, that the Americans had taken. They'd shown a willingness to die. So you obviously got kamikaze pilots, which are famous, but also if an island was captured and there was no chance of victory, often the Japanese would get themselves and any of the local inhabitants, and at times they would throw them off cliffs. And so it really stuck with the Americans that the people that we're fighting seem to love and embrace death. So if we invade Japan, we are going to, it's going to cost us a lot, let alone what it costs them. And so they thought, if we use these nuclear bombs, maybe that will deter them. But once again, it's a contentious issue. So they dropped 2 bombs 2 weeks later. They drop a bomb, and then on the 15th of August, so they drop a bomb on the 6th of August, on the 9th of August, Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki. Then the Emperor Hirohito goes on the national radio and says that they surrender, which sounds pretty straightforward, except the fact that most Japanese had never even heard him speak before. It was not something that the Japanese emperor would do. He never heard his voice in public. And so he actually breaks tradition there by actually going out in public and saying, we are going to surrender. And so eventually on the 2nd of September, just 6 years and 1 day after the war begins, the Japanese surrender, and the war is officially over. There are stories of Japanese soldiers who, various islands in the Pacific, who don't hear that this happens or don't get officially told by their military that this is over. And so they actually stay fighting and in war conditions up until the 1970s. The war is incredible. The impact of the war is still felt today. Some good resources on it. This is a good short history of World War II. It's just really short chapters that kind of go through what we've talked about. This book has just recently come out in Christian bookstores. 10 courageous Christians who supported Jews during the Holocaust. It looks good. I haven't read the whole thing, but it does look a good read. But yeah, if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask.